to be making plans at this point with such uncertain and volatile economies. And so it's not lost on me that you could be anywhere else doing something else. But I'm so grateful that you decided to join me and Africa Matters in this webinar on gender-based violence in Africa. So my name is Alundrah Sibanda. I am a co-founder of Shielded Africa. Shielded Africa came about after my co-founders and I, Eddie Babalanda, who is from Uganda, and Olfa Shelby, who's from Tunisia. We were at the Borderless Youth Forum, which was hosted by the UNODC and the Thailand Institute of Justice. And we were just randomly put into a team which was on gender-based violence. And this was something that we found out that we were particularly passionate about. So we had one of the best presentations that came out of that forum. And then it led to a presentation at the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, which was in Thailand as well, but we did it online. So we came back and we started talking to each other about the fact that we'd like to do more campaigns about what we are passionate about, which is gender-based violence in our communities. And how can we keep on working together? That was the question. And so we decided to give longevity to our cause by starting an organization. Shielded Africa is very young. It started in March 2020. So we're just shy of a year having started doing this work. So that's the background story on our organization. And what I do at Shielded Africa, well, I handle the communications and media affairs, and I also ensure that we have effective youth partnerships. So this includes moderating panels with young African leaders who are actively working against gender-based violence in their communities. And also, if there's a trending story that's hitting the headlines or a trending hashtag, or maybe something that's hard-hitting that is happening in Africa that has to do with gender-based violence, we make sure that there are people on the ground, youth on the ground, that can share their experiences with us and really give us real-time reactions to what is happening in their communities. To that end, last year, we were able to document what was happening with the Bacha shutdown in Lesotho and also the End SARS movement in Nigeria. So I am aware that after I have described the work that I do, and after I have said that, you know, my title is co-founder of Shielded Africa, it gives me the legitimacy to be giving this talk. But I would also like to share a story that I'm particularly ashamed of, which has to do with gender-based violence. So I remember this was after my first year in university. I felt like I was stressed out. I had just had a really tough semester at university. And I just thought, listen, I'm just going to rest. I need to take a break, come home, take a break, and forget about everything that's been going on in school. And so I used to watch series night and day without fail. And I remember it was 2 a.m. in the morning and I was watching How to Get Away with Murder, absolutely enjoying Annalise Keating in the courtroom and in class. And suddenly there was a loud bang at our window. And I thought, listen, I'm just going to ignore this, right? And then this person kept banging. And then she starts screaming, he's doing it again, help me, he's doing it again. And I remember running to my mom's room and saying, listen, you guys do very weird things while I'm away at school. I don't know why there's banging at the window. Can you please just like get it to stop? And so my mom quickly started getting dressed and she called my cousin. And while she was getting dressed, she explained to me that our neighbor had a habit of hitting his wife, and that the only way he would stop doing it was if the wife came to call my mom, who is a woman who is of some sort of economic standing in our community, that, you know, he could at least talk to her as an equal, and then the violence would stop. And honestly, as my mom and the woman and my cousin walked away back to the man's house to speak to him, I just breathed a sigh of relief. I said, you know, at least I can get back to How to Get Away with Murder. I can get back to my series, because I thought it was none of my business. I sincerely thought that gender-based violence was none of my business. So from the story, you may have been able to glean what gender-based violence is, but here's a more comprehensive definition according to UNICEF. Gender-based violence is violence inflicted against a person because of their gender. It is one of the most notable human rights violations within all societies, and it includes physical, sexual, mental, or economic harm inflicted on a person because of the power imbalances between males and females. Gender-based violence is a phenomenon that is deeply rooted in gender inequality, and both women and men experience gender-based violence. And so, because women mostly experience gender-based violence, you'll mostly hear the term gender-based violence interchanged with violence against women and girls, or interchanged with forms of gender-based violence. So sexual harassment, rape, female genital mutilation, etc. And so we can start to understand how widespread and how pervasive gender-based violence is in Africa if we acknowledge that it takes place in the places that we frequent. So for example, in schools, in 2019, in Zimbabwe, where I'm from, teachers from both Chimanimani and Bulawayo were found guilty of raping or forcibly having sexual relations with students that they were in charge of educating. In 2018, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, teachers and senior authorities were using their status to abuse girls who did not know their rights. It happens in universities when we go and further our education. In 2019, Uyinene Mrechwana, a student of the University of Cape Town in South Africa, took a fatal walk to the post office where she was raped and murdered. It happens in the churches, which are places of worship for us. Vera Omozua was raped and killed in her church in southern Nigeria in 2020. And it happens on dates with people we trust, dates with people we love, in bars where we go for drinks to hang out with our friends. It happens in our neighbors' homes, like the story that I told. And it also happens in our homes. So essentially what all this means is that we don't have the luxury of saying that gender-based violence is none of our business. And often when we talk about gender-based violence, people will say that there's anecdotal evidence. These are just stories that happen that are isolated here and there. But I believe that these are the stories that make you care, that it puts a name to the issue that we're talking about. But if you're a numbers person, and if numbers will make you care more about this phenomenon, these are the names and stories that are just numbers that we read in papers or we read in research. Sorry, I think there's something in the chat. Okay, got it. Okay, today, the risk of child marriage is highest in sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 1 in 3 women aged 20 to 24 years were married before the age of 18. At least 200 million women and girls aged between 15 and 49 years have undergone female genital mutilation in 31 countries where the practice is concentrated. In the Middle East and North Africa, 40 to 60% of women experience street-based sexual harassment. In Liberia, there is a 50% increase in gender-based violence in the first half, or there was a 50% increase in gender-based violence in the first half of 2020, which was between January and June, and there were 600 reported rape cases. Now, as I highlighted with the work that I do, and as someone who was trained as a journalist, I am particularly concerned about the representation of gender-based violence in African media. Media is a tool that we use to showcase our culture. It's the tool that we use to give certain topics prominence and importance. It's what we use to celebrate and communicate. Okay, I'll take that again. Media is the tool that we use to showcase our culture. It's what we use to give certain topics prominence and importance, to highlight what we celebrate, to communicate our disdain towards certain issues, and to also communicate our contempt towards certain issues. So every time some form of gender-based violence is expressed in the media, I always ask myself, are we clearly communicating to African audiences that our stance is that we stand against gender-based violence? I'll start with the moments that media in Africa was a champion for the fight against gender-based violence. The Black Label campaign, #NoExcuses, mobilized people to protect women, to raise awareness, and also start conversations about gender-based violence. The amazing song by Loyiso Gijana, Madoda Sabelani in South Africa, was one that he started off wanting to dedicate to Inene. And then eventually he dedicated it to all of the victims of femicide in South Africa. Next, there is the films Oloture and Citation, which were showcased on Netflix from Nigeria. I've watched both these movies and I'm quite a fan. I guess we could call this a movie recommendation before we call it one of my examples. Oloture is really the story of a journalist who has seen that there are issues in terms of human trafficking in Nigeria. And then when she suddenly actually goes into the world of that human trafficking, she finds out that there is violence that's also involved in women being trafficked to these different places. And then Citation, I believe, is a way of, I guess, concentrating the conversation that had been happening in terms of, it's a way of concentrating the conversation that had been happening on sex for grades, which was on BBC Africa. So on BBC Africa, they were talking about the fact that professors in Nigeria were exchanging sex for grades in universities. And in Citation, it's really an explanation that follows the story of one young woman and all of the regurgitating that she has to do about her story of sexual violence. Additionally, there was an experimental media campaign in Uganda where over 10,000 Ugandans in 112 rural villages were exposed to messages about gender-based violence. And what they found was that the people in the group were less likely to believe that they would be labeled a gossip if they spoke about their gender-based violence experiences. And they were also less likely to commit acts of gender-based violence. In Morocco as well, there was #Masaktak. I'm probably saying this wrong, but it translates to I will not be silent. And it really was talking about breaking the silence surrounding sexual violence in Morocco. And many women were found to not believe that they were a gossip, to not believe that they needed to hold shame when it came to issues of gender-based violence and talking about their gender-based violence experiences. One of the issues that was highlighted in the study was the fact that there is a level of classism and elitism that comes in NGOs that speak up about gender-based violence. And this is also a really important thing to highlight, while understanding that there is progress, that progress can be elitist. Who has access to cell phones? Who is it that's got access to education, or even access to speaking out and not having any repercussions? And so I will now move on to the criticism of how media speaks about gender-based violence in Africa. A lot of studies showed that there were hierarchies given to certain types of gender-based violence. So reports would maybe focus more on more on rape than they would focus on female genital mutilation, or more on sexual harassment in universities than they would focus on it in schools, meaning that there is a particular target audience that is also being serviced when these reports are made in the media. Additionally, limited types of mass media at the disposal of journalists were shown. So there would often be moments where you see that, okay, maybe rape is being reported on in newspapers, but it's actually not being reported on social media, or no one's willing to talk about it on television. And so that makes things difficult because then you're not reaching the multiple audiences that you can. And additionally, they noticed that reporting on gender-based violence was event-based. And so it's people just telling a story. Someone was raped, someone experienced sexual harassment, but they're not actually saying in depth what sexual harassment, what are the effects of sexual harassment? What causes sexual harassment in that setting? And how can we support the person that has gone through this instance of gender-based violence? And so maybe right now, since I've spoken about the media that has shone in terms of fighting gender-based violence, and also the criticism on how media reports on gender-based violence in Africa, you might be asking yourself, what is the best way to reach people with conversations about gender-based violence? Or maybe what is the best way that I can start a conversation about gender-based violence in my home or in my community? And I believe that there are certain guidelines that will be helpful. Firstly, find out what is relevant for the times. Currently, we are on lockdown, and so social media is what is relevant for the times, or at least what a lot of people have access to. And so it is important to speak to people and go to them where they are. Social media videos, Instagram, WhatsApp messages are spreading like wildfire when it comes to COVID conspiracies. That same style can be used when talking about gender-based violence and actually giving really constructive information about gender-based violence. And it's also important, as the next point, to add context to debates and to give more meat to information about gender-based violence. And so if we are reporting on gender-based violence in the media or on social media, what is the meat of the story, right? It's yes, the event that has happened, but also can we talk about how to prevent it from happening in the future? Who needs to be part of these conversations? Who are the perpetrators? Why are they acting in the manner that they are? Let's have those full, well-rounded conversations. And as I highlighted before, it's important to have a multimedia approach because that reaches more people. There should be collaboration with governments. I think very often governments get a bad rep in terms of how they deal with issues of gender-based violence, and rightfully so. People are angry and they're allowed to be. But it's also important to add your voice to the solutions that governments can implement in order to speak more effectively or communicate more effectively about gender-based violence in your community. I also believe that you cannot leave out children from the conversation. Start to talk to them about the simple things, about consent, how to say yes, how to say no, how to respect someone's yes, how to respect someone's no, and not force yourself on them. What is it that children should not be allowing adults to do to them, right? Or other children to do? Where should adults not touch? Where should another child not be touching you? What is an acceptable form of play and what is not? Because very often you will find children explaining that their introduction to sexual experiences happens when they are playing. And if media is more targeted in terms of speaking to children about these issues in a way that they will understand, then there will be less of these instances. And additionally, just going off of speaking to children in a language that they can understand, it is important to simplify the language that we use when we talk about gender-based violence. I always say we talk about patriarchy to people who don't understand what it is. And even then, we spend a lot of time speaking about theory when we could explain to people practically what needs to stop. Stop beating your wife is a much easier thing to say than you are displaying traits of male superiority, right? And I think it also has the message showing up in a more relatable way and in a way that people can understand. And often campaigns about gender-based violence are tagged towards people, right? So if someone decides to put me on a campaign about gender-based violence, if I leave the particular media organization where I'm communicating about gender-based violence, what often happens is that there is no continuity plan. And I believe that there should be continuity plans, that campaigns should be able to last beyond the person. Gender-based violence is an issue that is plaguing many people in society and plaguing society. It is not about a person. And so I believe that these are the tips that we can use to communicate more effectively about gender-based violence in Africa. I will now move on to the questions that I received from the Africa Matters team. The first one was, in your opinion, the contribution of culture, customs, and traditions in the growing rate of violence against women in Africa? Now, this is a really good question because we celebrate culture in Africa and we do that really well. You can even go to other continents and hear about Ubuntu and Ujamaa. And we are also very quick to defend cultural appropriation. Let someone show up in braids when they truly don't understand their historical context, then there will be fights, right? But we also need to be honest about the fact that there can be a dark side to our culture, that there can be a dark side to our socialization and our norms and what we deem as normal. I don't believe that in a community, we can have child marriages happening over and over again if it is not normal. If it is not normal for a 10-year-old to show up and start acting as a wife in someone's home, and for a 10-year-old to start having children, even though they are not biologically developed enough to be going through that process, then it won't happen. But very often we've made things normal in our societies. And that is what our culture has contributed. And additionally, there are a lot of patriarchal norms in our societies, right? There are a lot of social, cultural, and religious factors that make men feel like there is only a certain way to perform masculinity. And those ways usually include objectifying women, treating them like objects that they own, and also allowing this notion that women can have sex with them whenever they want to continue. And so I believe that that is a very strong contribution of our culture to the continuation of gender-based violence in Africa. And next, in terms of FGM, I'm not particularly familiar with a lot about FGM, but upon my reading, I did find out that when it comes to FGM, it often happens along the pretext of social, cultural, and religious beliefs. And so women are told to alter themselves and alter their genitals for the enjoyment and for the pleasure of men. And that is often something that is perpetuated by older women. So it's older women telling younger women that they should alter themselves in order to satisfy men. And it's something that takes away the dignity of a woman and her equality, right? Are you created to be an object of somebody's pleasure? That is the question that you should be asking yourself when you are altering yourself in order to satisfy someone else. The second question was, there are some common contributing factors, or what are some common contributing factors for women who choose to stay in abusive marriages and relationships? I believe that the first one is a low self-esteem. When someone has beaten you over and over, or has consistently told you that you are worth nothing, or has acted like you are worth nothing, you're likely to stay in that situation because you don't feel that you deserve better. And secondly, there's an issue of fear. What do you do without this man? What do you do without your support system? What do you do without the person who wields the power? And also, I guess this is a good time to explain that gender-based violence also happens to men. And so when women are in that seat of power also, and then choosing to inflict violence on men because they have the economic seat of power, it is also fear that keeps the men in those relationships. And it's also the savior complex, right? Thinking that you can love someone out of treating you badly. And that's something, I guess, that is the domain more of psychologists, explaining to women or working through with that woman that she doesn't have to save someone. She doesn't have to perform for someone's love or become a savior and stay in a dangerous situation. Additionally, particularly in Africa, and especially in my culture, you will hear Ndirubu. Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. I believe I was talking about why women stay in abusive relationships, and I was at the point of wanting to be a savior. Oh, no, I'd moved from wanting to be a savior to the point of children. So very often what will happen, especially where I'm from in Zimbabwe, is you will hear Ndinogarira vana vangu, which means that I will stay from my children. And so women feel that they're not maybe economically stable enough to take care of their children. And they want to show their children what a stable home looks like. And so when they experience instances of gender-based violence, maybe within their marriages or within their partnerships, they feel that they cannot leave. And that feeds into the last one on financial constraints. If we are being very honest, the people at the top of the food chain are often men, and they use that economic power to inflict gender-based violence on women often. And so with them being at the top of the food chain, at the bottom are the women that they choose to abuse. And they feel that these women feel that they won't be able to provide for themselves if they decide to leave these abusive situations. The next question I received was, what role can men play in the fight against gender-based violence in Africa? I really love this question because I have very simple answers to it. Number one is listen. Listen when women are talking about their experiences about gender-based violence. Listen to women when they talk about the fact that societal norms are in favor of men and that they end these situations at the hands of men. I think very often there's a lot of interjecting that happens, or a lot of conversations that happen that are full of arguments of men feeling the need to defend themselves without actually listening to what women have to say. And next is read. Find out what is being said about gender-based violence in your community, or just gender-based violence in general. Read and equip yourself with the information in order for you to make informed decisions in your relationships, and also to make informed decisions around what you spread to the next generation of men. And that also feeds into calling out conversations that objectify women. So men sit around and have conversations in which they objectify women, and those conversations, well, at least I believe in linkages, that conversations will turn into actions, and those actions have consequences, like gender-based violence. Also, talk to your friends, and that seems like a simple thing to say, but peer-to-peer education has actually proven to be a very effective way to teach people about gender-based violence, and even about any other topic. Finding people of the same age who you can relate to speaking about a topic is a really effective way to help in the fight against gender-based violence. And also protect the vulnerable in your society. If you feel that you have the physical strength to be able to protect someone, or maybe if you feel like you are the one who is able to start conversations and be heard and speak with authority against someone who is an abuser, then do that. And I'll also say, lastly, show your face. That conversations about gender-based violence shouldn't always be happening and shouldn't always be the domain of women. That when the next gender-based violence in Africa webinar happens on Africa Matters, it should also involve a man on the panel. Say something so that people that look like you, or people that believe they have shared experiences to you, feel like they are a part of the conversation and feel like they too can contribute to fighting gender-based violence. I am going to check on the question in the chat. The question in the chat is, how can schools be made a safer place for girls or female learners? behaviorally and socially, how can education be used to combat the gender roles that lead to gender-based violence? I think for the first question, which is how can schools be made a safer place? It takes me back to, I guess, primary school, and there's nothing I hated other than the aunties that used to come and talk to us about periods, or they would talk to us about becoming a woman and what womanhood truly means. But they contributed immensely to my life and contributed immensely to the lives of my friends and how they viewed themselves as women. Those people's conversations, the fact that they even started the conversation and started to say, hey, I'm willing to impart knowledge on the next generation about this, made it, I guess, safer for us to, it made it safer for us to be in school and have a particular mindset about ourselves in terms of confidence. And I believe that that too can come back to gender-based violence, right? You make it safer by having the right conversations. You make it safer by explaining to girls what shouldn't be happening to them, and also explaining to them that there are avenues for them to report these issues. One of the things my younger sister always says is that she'll be quick to report to a teacher, even if it's the most mundane thing, because that person has made it a safe space for them. And so I think it's that, making sure that teachers are a safe space for students, but also then putting the burden on parents to also ensure that they are a safe space for children. That if, you know, it is then your teacher who is supposed to be your caregiver during school hours that hurts you or abuses you in any way, you can speak to your parents about it. And ensuring also that there is some form of justice after the fact. I believe truly that students cannot be told to report issues and then know that there will be no punishment or no investigation whatsoever afterwards. So at least in my opinion, that's what I believe. That's how I believe we can make schools safer. And also in terms of education to combat the roles that lead to GBV, well, that's about having open and honest conversations about what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, and the fact that there is no one way to be a man and there is no one way to be a woman. And I think whatever conversation you have with your children about their womanhood or their manhood, at the end of the day, it needs to come to a point where you explain that as long as they are not hurting someone else, who they are is okay. As long as what they do does not hurt someone else, how they express themselves in society, how they show up in a room is okay. And I think allowing that difference is really important. I think it's often that rigidity and teaching men to behave a certain way or women to always behave a certain way that leads to those strong connotations of how, of toxic masculinity, as we call it, or of men feeling superior. So that's how I would answer that question. But I'm also willing to learn from you. How do you think education can be used to combat gender-based violence in schools? I'm also going to move on to the next question, which was, what role can women play in the fight against gender-based violence in Africa? I think it's speaking up, moving away from the domain of shame and speaking up about the things that are happening in their societies and not making gender-based violence a secret. That's truly important, because the moment one woman speaks up, it frees the next one to say something about, you know, the pain that they're experiencing, and knowing that they're not alone and knowing that they have support. And I also believe that older women should be willing to change their mindset around gender-based violence. They should be willing to sort of pass down lessons that don't look like what was passed down to them. In our example about FGM, I talked about how older women are often the ones that do the cutting of younger women. So just do not be a part to that, right? Like, be a part of reading and learning more, and then passing down information that empowers the next woman. The last question, which I would like to say is my favorite, was when other forms of violence erupt in various African states, the economy usually suffers. However, in spite of having some of the highest numbers of rape cases in the world, the economies of African states, and I think of South Africa in particular, seem unaffected by gender-based violence. Why do you think that this is the case? Very often when we talk about economics, we're talking about risk, right? The fact that investors will start running away when wars break out or when there is widespread violence. And why I like this question is because it talks about the attitudes that we often have towards gender-based violence, that we believe that gender-based violence is separate from war, that it's separate from widespread violence. But very often, gender-based violence is taking place in there, right? So rape is a well-known tool of war. It's a well-known weapon of war. I mean, when the International Criminal Court is often presiding over cases about war crimes, rape is one of the issues that comes up often. And so you cannot separate the two. You cannot separate abductions of children, then going into marriages, or you cannot separate the human trafficking that happens during war from widespread violence in countries causing economic decline. So economic decline, when it comes due to, at least due to violence, according to me, it also comes due to gender-based violence. It's just that when we look at electoral violence, when we look at war, when we look at widespread violence, we decide that gender-based violence is not a part of the equation. And that needs to stop as well. How do we address the violence in our communities while also having the conversation about gender-based violence? Those are not two separate things. And so in summary, I think the major takeaway, at least for me, that I believe everyone should go away with from this talk is that we should all care about gender-based violence, that we have no right to sit back and say that we don't care. And I have a contribution that is in the chat, which says, well said, Alundrah, about us older women. Yet we go through emotional violence. And that's true. I think that it's also important, though, to also know that, I guess, there's a certain level of privilege that comes with being in this conversation, Christine. There's a level of privilege because then we can sit here, we have Wi-Fi connections, we can have these conversations. But there are people that we are not allowing that conversation to filter down to. And so I think it's important, the conversations that you have with your friends, right? As older women, what is it that we are teaching children? And I think also, what is it that we're teaching children by our modeling? So not just what we are saying to them, but what we are doing. When I say I'm staying for my children, then what happens to my children? What is the psyche that they have when they have children? So always remember that you're passing down things, not only in what you say, but in what you do. And also another question is, I strongly feel most females would like to report any form of gender-based violence they would have suffered from, but they decide otherwise for fear of stigmatization thereafter. What can help women overcome this? I think, like I said, the more one person speaks, the more other people feel liberated to do so as well. It sounds like a very airy-fairy concept, but I truly believe that the more we speak, the more other women will speak. And also, that you are right about the fact that, you know, we talk about freedom of speech, right? Like, is there freedom after speech? So what are the consequences of me having spoken out? Or what are the consequences in terms of stigmatization after I speak out? And I think we need to also create safe havens. People should know that they can go to organizations where this stigmatization doesn't exist, where after they speak, they are treated like a human being. And there should also be some form of, I guess, rehabilitation into community. How do I then speak about my abuse with my community in such a way that they don't shun me? And I think it's goes back to me at least, and I center my world around media because that's what I know. But it goes back to the conversations that are happening in media as well. After someone is raped, do we then start calling them by certain names? Do we call them damaged and broken? What is it that we call them? Or do we allow them to, yes, experience all the psychological and emotional trauma that comes with it, but also tell them that it's possible to walk away victorious? And so I think that those are the conversations that need to be happening in our media, even in the soapies that we watch every day, and even in the way that we report about issues in terms of gender-based violence. And I think it will then make it easier for people to speak out. Hi, Alundrah. Thank you for the presentation. Welcome. My point goes to females. Ladies, let us stop saying stay when there's gender-based violence. I'm a victim of gender-based violence, but instead of hiding, I've penned a memoir about my marriage, soon to be released. Still, women and mostly men are of the notion, right? So that means what nobody knows, like what stays in this house, what happens in this house stays in this house. There is a pastor called Dr. Anita Phillips, and she speaks very well about just bringing things into the light. And the fact that after you bring things into the light, you have to deal with it, whether it's ugly or how beautiful it is. You have to deal with it. And I love that you've written a memoir, because that means that this issue that you've been through shows up into the light. Everyone can see it. And now it's time to find out about your support system as well. Who can be there for you? Who can walk with you through this journey after having suffered through gender-based violence? Because the emotions don't just go away, right? I mean, one day you're fine, one day you're not, or you think you've healed, but then it also comes crashing down. So how do you know, like, how will you know who can help you or who can take care of you if you're not willing to speak out? But also on the flip side, it's important not to just out victims. I truly believe in waiting for when someone feels comfortable enough to talk about it. And I'm so grateful for your story, because I believe that it will liberate other women as well. I don't know if there are any other questions. KD? I'm just going to wait to find out if there are any other questions, because if they aren't, I will log out. Oh, thank you, Alundrah. How do you help someone who is in an abusive relationship, but they're scared to leave? Our presentation at the anniversary of the Beijing Declaration was about exit plans. I think that, you know, one of the questions we addressed here was about women staying in abusive relationships. And the truth is, when we talk about women staying in abusive relationships, we make it seem like they're these scared little people that are not willing to do what is necessary in order to step out, right? But the truth is that their reasoning for staying is valid. So firstly, ask them why they're staying. And then after you've found out what the issue is, for example, the issue could be, okay, I don't have the finances. What happens? I'm out on the streets if I leave this person, right? So what does the world look like in terms of marketing your skills? What does the world look like in terms of you getting an education and then being able to get out of there? Additionally, I think it's really just being a support system as well. You can't be the one to force someone out. I think, like I was saying about outing victims, it's so difficult to just be like, oh, you know, get out and force yourself on someone. But if their will is truly to leave, find out what the issue is and try your best to be a support system to the point where they feel like, okay, now we've overcome this issue. What's the next issue? Because that's what happens with abuse victims. You will now, you know, you'll fix one issue and then you'll find out what the next is, fix that one, find out what the next is, until they are ready and truly believe that they have enough of an exit plan to get out of there. Yes, I think that's my answer to that question. Thank you, Lulu. More women need to listen to you and to listen to you more than once. Well done. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you to everyone for being here. And I truly hope that we will start. Oh, Okay, no, another question. How do cultural norms in the African context perpetuate gender-based violence, and how can we engage in changing values? So we did have the conversation about cultural norms in the African context and how they perpetuate gender-based violence. And I really think it's about what we think is normal. So Teboho, in terms of like normalizing things, that is something we talk about in our generation, right? Like what is normal? And often if a rape is normal, if date rape is normal, if child marriages are normal, then they will continue in our society. There needs to be a culture of calling out things. It's rather to start cultures, right? Because one of the things that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talks about is the fact that culture evolves. It doesn't just stop at one thing. Whatever you believe is culture now may have not been culture 50 years ago. And so allow it to evolve to the point where things are being called out if they are not right and if they are harmful to other people. And like I said before, there is no one way of being. As long as your way of being honors who you are and does not harm anyone else, then that's okay. That's how we change values, and that's how we change the cultural norms. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. I guess we're wrapping up now. KD, I appreciate you. And thank you to the Africa Matters team. Have a good evening, everyone.